Well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm pleased to introduce today's seminar speaker, Jaron Porciello of Cornell's Department of Global Development. Jaron's the PI and co-director for a program called Series 2030, Sustainable Solutions to End Hunger. It's a three-year multi-institutional initiative that brings together evidence and cost models for G7 donor decision-making as they explore their role in the international effort to end hunger. She's also a PI for a program in agriculture in the digital age, another evidence-based review looking at proliferation of digital technology and data analytics in agriculture. Jaron's an information and data scientist. She holds an undergraduate degree and 2 master's degrees from Indiana University. And her work brings together technology, group work, and research methods to connect policy and science across the global food system. She's got a lot of experience leading and managing these ambitious global projects in agriculture and rural development. Those projects involve lots of stakeholders, universities, publishers, funding international agencies, foundations, NGOs, to achieve shared goals to advance access to and acceleration of data and knowledge for public good. Previously, Jaron was the program manager for Research for Life, which was a public-private partnership of UN agencies, publishers, and universities. And I got to know her when she managed an initiative called TEAL. She was director of TEAL, the Essential Electronic Agricultural Library, which was one of the world's longest running programs to facilitate journal access to scientists in the developing world. So Jaron, thanks so much for being with us today.
Great. Thank you, Terry. Thanks for that nice introduction. I have to say it's always a pleasure to go down sort of one's own memory lane and sort of remember all the projects and partnerships and things that I've been a part of for my 12 years at Cornell University. So, you know, as Terry mentioned, I won't say too much more about my background here, other than to say I spend a lot of time with data, with information, with people who are really trying to kind of think hard about how they use data and information to make decisions. And so that's what we're going to talk about here today. So I'd like to present some specific findings from a new report, and a report that Ed Mumbai is also a co-author on, called Agriculture in the Digital Age. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull up my slides. And just so you know, while I do, I'm actually going to turn off my presenter video because I have a monitor that's facing this direction, and it gets really awkward if you're just sort of seeing the side of my face. So I'm going to stop the video on my side just during the presentation and then come back on for our discussion. All right, and if anyone can give me a thumbs up, that would be great. Are you able to see my slides?
Loud and clear, we receive you.
Excellent, thank you. Okay. So as I mentioned, what we're going to talk about are some findings from a new report that were financed from a study from USAID, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, with support from the World Bank and FAO as well, called Agriculture in the Digital Age. And what the study is really focused on is what information, empirical evidence do we have about how farmers are using digital services in low and middle income countries. And there we are. So first I want to introduce the project team. So this work began in June of 2020 in collaboration with a really wonderful, but as you can see, small research team. And I just want to say it's not an easy feat to launch new work. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this. To launch any kind of new work, and especially original research during these really strange times when there's so many normal patterns of feedback and flow and support that are disrupted. But this has been an incredible project team, and I'm really proud of the work that we did. So what is this project all about? What did we want to know? So overall, what we were looking for is to basically get a global understanding of what the empirical evidence looks like. Oops. So what do we know about the spectrum of digital services and those service providers in agriculture that are reported in the empirical literature? Sorry, there's some fighting happening here. We wanted to know who was being reached by digital services in low and middle income countries. We wanted to know what kind of services were being offered and what type of impact they might be having and how much of an impact. And then we really wanted to know more about what was helping and hindering use of digitally enabled agricultural services, and why some people are able to make better use of them and others are not. And so to examine these questions, we used a systematic scoping study method. And for those who are maybe familiar or have kind of just heard these terms like systematic review or evidence synthesis, what this really breaks down to is that this is a type of method by which we can examine a really large body of knowledge and research. We can thematically characterize things, we can understand sort of the range and nature of existing evidence, and then we can actually document this down at the individual study level. What are the main sources and types of evidence available? And there's a long, complicated history of evidence synthesis in other fields, in particular the medical and health fields. But we don't see this as much in agriculture due to the complex and really heterogeneous nature of what we have in agricultural evidence. We have economics with geography, with plant sciences, with social sciences, with demographics. So a lot of information needs to be brought together for us to be able to think about how we aggregate and understand what's happening in agriculture. But I will say that this method is emerging and it's a really useful approach to guide a study like this one, because it basically documents at a very transparent level that I'll talk a little bit more about what's happening in each individual study. So how do we go from a huge data set down to a much more smaller focused one? And I think just to say that what I'm going to present, I'm going to start with the methods and give some information about that. And it may seem like a lot of setup, but there's kind of two things that I want us to keep in mind as I go through this. And the first thing is that evidence is built across thousands of observations over time. And so one breakthrough study can help ignite a new line of research. But most decisions are based on a body of knowledge, not a single study. And so it's really important that we pay attention to how these reports are designed that are going to go on to influence decision-making. And so I think, like the nutritional labels on our food, that our data reports and our knowledge reports really need to come with more information about what's in the studies that we look at before we present a bunch of findings to decision makers. And second, what's also important is that it's essential for scientific communication at every level that we meet stakeholders where they are. So we shouldn't expect decision makers to have the same kind of understanding of scientific process as scientists. And so we need to figure out sort of new ways of transforming knowledge, and particularly large bodies of knowledge and information in ways that can help them, but are also responsive to the nuance and details that are important to scientists. So I hope you're kind of getting a sense that, it's one thing to lay this out kind of very linearly here, but there's actually a lot of decision-making and thought that needs to go into how we evaluate such a big and complex body of knowledge, like the one that we looked at. And so just to give you a sense, some of the things that we're looking for in the individual studies that we assess are where we see original data, where we see mention of interventions, where we're finding outcomes, what's the quality and context, and kind of so on and so forth. And as I mentioned, we do that through the process of a scoping review. And then kind of here's how we break down a really large data set. So our data set started at more than 7,000 records. And these were from peer-reviewed journals. They were from agency and gray literature repositories. We held an open call for researchers across the globe to submit, impact and assessment evaluations from their organizations or from their own research that we may not find otherwise. So we really tried to go broad and compile a huge data set for, for this very important question. And then we thought a lot about what is it that each individual study needs to present. And so you can see it's really important that we be so structured when we're looking at so much data. Otherwise, it can be easy to cherry pick studies based on our own bias and what we're used to seeing. So I'm not going to go through the methods of this in great detail, other than to give you a sense of there's a real strict kind of process that we follow through the identification, the screening, the eligibility, and then the included stage that actually get us down to this number of 315 studies that we looked at in great detail, analyzed for about 90 different data points before we could come to any conclusions. So I'm happy to talk to people offline if they're interested more sort of in the methods at this level. But I think this is probably enough detail for the class for us to kind of move on so that I can explain some of the frameworks and the findings to you. So first, I want to just give you a sense. We organized the study according to these three frameworks that I highlighted in the kind of the conceptual map. So what are the services? What's actually being presented in the literature, and can we categorize them in different ways? So overall, we found sort of evidence across these four buckets: digital advisory and extension, digital financial services, digitized farm tools, and digital market linkages. And then we were able to provide more specific examples of interventions sort of over here. Hopefully this doesn't look at all shocking to you. I mean, one of the things about an evidence synthesis is it really should reflect kind of what's out there in the body of knowledge. So if you're familiar with the field, hopefully these don't look too surprising to you. The second framework that we worked through was thinking about our outcome categories and descriptions. So again, these break down into four buckets as well, where we've got specific outcomes featured here in agricultural-led growth, income, productivity, yield, resilience and risk, where we're looking for initiatives around climate resiliency and cost effectiveness. We're looking for instances around environmental sustainability and nutrition, the healthy people on the planet, and inclusivity, empowerment, and agency, where we're looking for studies that focused on gender, social inclusion, and social learning. And then finally, the third framework is descriptive details that emerge from the literature that we could organize into this overall framework that was, this is actually a framework developed by another researcher named Venkatesh, who developed this in 2008 and then updated it in 2013. But we were able to take all of the descriptive details that researchers and practitioners describe in their overall reports, and then categorize them into what's the benefit of particular technologies. Is the technology easy to use? How much are social networks inspiring or dissuading service use? And are target users able to use a service? And so within each one of these hexagons is the number of studies that mentioned each one of these individual facilitators and barriers. So that's kind of, that's sort of the framing of the overall study. And just to point out too, we do have an online resource and an online report that goes through this in much more detail. But if you're interested in kind of looking at those 315 studies and how they map across these different categories of outcomes, interventions, and facilitating barriers, then the URL is available here. Great. Okay, so I want to move into some findings and sort of talk a little bit about what does all this effort lead to, and what do we know and what do we see now that we couldn't see previously. So first, I want us to take a look at this evidence gap map here. And the way to I'll just give some quick orientation. The way to look at this is across the traditional y-axis over here. We have our broad service types, so digital advisory and extension services, and the narrow service types here. And then across what would be the x-axis is the different outcomes that we have, agricultural-led growth, broken down into each individual outcome. Then one more layer here is looking at whether a study reported positive, nil, or mentioned, whether or not an outcome in the particular study. Each number here indicates the number of studies overall that describe, positive, nil, or mentioned. And just so you're aware, this mentioned category is where we had practitioners and researchers mentioning an outcome, but there wasn't quite enough substantive data presented for us to be able to discern whether positive, negative, or nil outcomes were actually taking place. Why, just one more thing, why this mentioned is really important is this gives us a sense of sort of where researchers and practitioners are headed in the future. What are people, really interested in embedding within their research, and what are they able to capture? So kind of with that orientation, here's a little bit more about what we actually know. So 70% of the studies that we looked at fell into this digital advisory and extension services category. Primarily, you can see here that the studies are looking at agricultural-led growth. And then to some extent, there is discussion about gender inclusivity and empowerment, particularly with regard to increased knowledge, a little bit to do with gender, and some with social learning. If we look, however, at the other categories, let me just go on here. The evidence gap map starts to change quite a bit. So if we're looking at digital financial services and digitized farm tools, we see huge gaps kind of in the evidence base here, particularly for resiliency and risk, and healthy people and planet with regard to environmental sustainability. So this gaps helps, this obviously helps us see what's going on in the literature, but it also, to me, signals where we see a lot of bias and limitations in our own data set. So I mentioned those 315 studies that are feeding into this evidence gap map, and that those studies are coming from a range of great literature sources, agency reports, NGO reports, and the peer-reviewed science. What we're not able to see is a lot of information coming from the private sector. So we do have some case studies in here from implementer groups like Mercy Corps and GSMA that have profiled private sector companies, but I have a feeling that this whole section of the map would look quite different if we were able to get access to important data from the private sector, specifically with regard to digital financial services like mobile money. So again, while this does a thorough job of mapping the data set that we have, it would look different if we were able to bring in that private sector data. And so that's, something that we're thinking a lot about. And then this is kind of the last category here, digital market linkages. Again, we're seeing quite a few gaps, particularly around gender in this particular one, which pointed out to us in particular that one of the ways for women in particular to sort of increase their empowerment and their agency in this space is through self-supported business. And if we're not seeing close links between digital market linkages and studies that are focusing in on this area with regard to gender, then we have a big kind of gap in the evidence base and in what maybe some assumptions that we're making with regard to kind of what's going on. So, again, this kind of helps us see what's happening across the space. And then there's other gaps for us to consider as well. One thing that jumped out to us that kind of told us, who is being reached and who is being left behind is that only 30% of the studies collected any data about social factors, about socioeconomic or demographic factors such as sex, age, education, or wealth. And so without that high quality underlying data, it's very difficult for us to be able to say with confidence in any aggregated way that our outcomes are leading to anything other than agricultural-led growth and productivity. And I think that this is squarely within the remit, our remit as researchers and scientists and practitioners. We need to be capturing data about people and not just about farm output and farm size and what's grown on the farm. Those are really important details, but when we're talking about services and particularly digital agricultural services, we need to know who we're talking about, and we need to have a better understanding of those contextual details. Second, there are significant gaps, as you could see on the map, with regard to climate and the environment. And I will say that this is mirrored in other evidence synthesis work that I've done, but certainly that other researchers have done, where we're just starting to see the connections between agriculture and the environment come together in meaningful ways. And so I think it's important that we continue to ask ourselves, how do we jumpstart research in this really important area? So, in the report, I give, we go through and we detail sort of these top 10 evidence gaps. And in particular, with the thought of where, if the goal of this report is to think about what are the new programs that we need for digital agriculture research for the future, where are donors best positioned to allocate resources to kind of help continue work in this space. Just a few other things that I want to touch on that we sort of saw from the study that I think challenge maybe some common narratives that are out there. So when we look at what type of data are actually fueling digital services, it's not sort of, big data from connected blockchains and sort of really exciting Internet of Things connectivity. It's really still being fueled by custom data services. So this DES generated data stands for digitally enabled agricultural services data, which is a fancy way of saying user profile data. So by and large, many of the services are being powered by data that users provide to the particular service provider. We're seeing that, a lot of expert knowledge goes into coding the different resources that are being provided, whether or not that's through some advisory service. There's a little bit of financial data that's coming through, some private data, a little bit of public sector data, and then public literature. But by and large, we're not seeing sort of huge data services kind of power the back end of many of the platforms. And again, I say this with some caution because that may be different if we were able to see, kind of up close and personal what that private sector data looks like. But again, we have a good representative data set and we're just not seeing this kind of innovation take place yet. The other kind of interesting facet to point out here is that when we look at the different facilitators and barriers across modalities, here we give some of what the facilitators and barriers are across the different modality of a phone call with a real person, a chat app, video, custom app, so on and so forth. And so we're really seeing that by and large, a phone call with a real person or a chat app with a real person is kind of still the primary way of delivering information to most farmers with regard to digitally enabled agricultural services. Not as much with sort of custom apps or video. Video is certainly accessible, but delivery of information through the video service gives some high kind of barriers for access here. And sort of where I kind of come to a close here and we can have a discussion is that one of the things about an evidence synthesis is it's really to point out sort of gaps and where things are not meeting the mark, which can be a little bit of a, it can be a little bit of a bummer in a way, but I think it's also important to highlight that there's a lot to celebrate that's emerging from the literature. And kind of here's 4 things that we see as hopeful signs. One is that nearly half of the studies that we assessed described that farmers are transforming existing services and making it applicable for their own needs. So there's a lot of innovation that's going on. And one of the recommendations that we make back to donors is to ensure that anytime a new service is going forward, please ensure that you're working directly with the end users before designing the service and to test the service. That's not something that we see built into all of the different projects that we reviewed. And this is kind of our -- recommendation back to the donors. It's already happening, so please facilitate better mechanisms for the work to go forward. The second kind of hopeful sign that we see is that social networks are embedded in every stage of the service process, from awareness to use to sustained use. And kind of interestingly, social networks show both positive and negative benefits. From the perspective of if the farmer doesn't have a social network, it seems that there's a lot less likelihood to learn about and be able to use digitally enabled agricultural services. So this facet needs a lot more exploration, But it's pretty interesting to see just how promising the role of working with different social networks, different farmers organizations, cooperatives, so on and so forth, can be for use of the services. Third is that gender is, it's a belated recognition, but we did find a lot of discussion, awareness, and research that was trying to incorporate gender more substantially into their work. So there's a high prevalence of gender mention signals that just tell us that researchers are really trying to incorporate gender in the design of their work. There's, I think, some work that needs to be done in the training and the toolkits and the data collection, but certainly the impetus to do the work is there. So that was exciting to see. And fourth is maybe a little bit more closer to home where we are at Cornell University. So we looked at whether universities have digital agriculture programs. And what we found is that most have precision agriculture programs. And it's unclear to the extent where curriculums are really drawing on some of those interdisciplinary questions and bringing in, social scientists, bringing in people who have expertise in gender design, so on and so forth, with agricultural scientists in sort of meaningful ways that incentivize them to work together on these really difficult interdisciplinary problems. So we see thoughtful experimentation going on there. And one recommendation we have back to the donors is to continue to think about how to encourage and meaningfully incentivize those collaborations. So I will not go through, I've mentioned some of the recommendations in my remarks here, so I won't spend more time going into detail on these recommendations, but just so that you can see them. And then I think where I would like to maybe just leave us here today is that one of the challenges that I think we all face is that it's incredibly difficult to synthesize knowledge accurately and fairly. And so how do we help those who are science adjacent, our policy makers, our donors, our citizens, kind of stay up to date? What are the decision-making tools that we need for the future? And then the second challenge that we continue to grapple with and face is that many of the problems that we work on in development are obviously situated in many countries in the global South. And scientists who are located in the global South and in many institutions face a lot of barriers to reaching publications in peer review literature. And so one of the challenges is that it's always easy to say, just publish on the web, right? Just publish on the website, which is a great way of getting ephemeral content out there. But it creates problems for a future discovery process like this one. And I see this kind of time and time again in both big consulting reports that are put out by agencies like McKinsey or groups like that, as well as with smaller resource projects like this one. And I think we did a good job ensuring that we tried to kind of close that gap. But in terms of what I mentioned earlier about evidence being created by thousands of observations over time, where we need to access research time and time again, what can we do? And how do we sort of think about this problem? So anyway, I'll go ahead and close there and stop sharing slides, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaron. Let's open it up to questions. Raise your hand. Ed and I will monitor those hands and or put questions in the chat box as always.
Raise your hand. You can't raise your hand.
Okay, Kuzo.
Yeah, so I think that was really interesting. And I was thinking about from researcher or someone who wants to do some projects and stuff, especially in digital ag, they probably need a lot of data from the ground base. So did you like what did you find, like how people like going around that problem of like feeding their mechanism with like a lot of data so that they could improve their model, and then that provide the services? And were there any like challenges in that aspect? Like what was the finding like?
So that's great. We can do this a few ways. Terry, is it better to just answer questions as they come up, or do you want me to
Yeah,
hold it?
why don't you go ahead and just answer them as they come up, if you don't mind.
No, that's perfect. So that's a great question. And so that slide on thinking about what data are actually powering different services was with regard to seeing, okay, if you need geospatial data, you need economic data, you want to get some user profile data, you want advisory information. Is all of that data actually coming together in ways that researchers can manage? Are there services out there that people can rely on? And by and large, we're not seeing, what we are seeing is that when that data does come together, it's usually done sort of at the custom level by the research team. There's not large scale data services that people can draw on. And this to me is a real, I worry about this a lot, because it basically means that without public sector funding coming in or research being done in this area, then we're going to basically turn those powers over to corporate entities and rely on them to build those types of data services for us. So kind of to answer your question, yes, people absolutely need a lot of that on the ground data. And there's not necessarily, we're not seeing a lot of evidence of cooperation for these services to come together for public sector use.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Jaron, we had a question in the chat box. Is it possible to get a copy of the slide framework 3 facilitators and barriers? Could you make the slide set available to us for posting on the Canvas site and sharing?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thanks for that. So it's also available on the website. So I just put the chat in, or the link in the chat rather. And there is sort of an interactive graphic on the website where if you click on any one of those hexagons, it'll basically take you to a filter where you can look through those studies in more detail. But happy to make the slides available, no problem.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Manoj.
Thanks, Jaron. I'm Manoj from Nepal, and I'm working in a bank, agricultural bank, and where from some database, we are just introducing some apps in mobile. But we found that the very few farmers our client are willing to use the app. Have you find any reason behind this in case of such developing countries? Why people are not willing to use app, rather they are willing to go directly to the offices and they want such in-person services?
That's a great question. And I think maybe classmates also have some thoughts about this as well. What we saw was there was an incredible preference for services where there was some kind of face-to-face, not face-to-face, but human-to-human interaction. So even if it was an interactive sort of video recording or access to human beings at some stage in the service profile, those were the services that were getting used and recommended much more than receiving sort of an app or being able to download an app from the Play Store. And I can't say that I don't know that that's necessarily true across all 4 of those different categories that we looked at, for instance, advisory and extension, which is where a lot of our evidence focused, because there is also sort of contrasting evidence that for mobile money, for instance, an app is perfect, an app is good enough, or a text message back and forth is good enough. So it does seem that it depends on the type of service that actually supports the behind the scenes service model that matters quite a bit. And so if your service in particular is offering some type of advisory and extension information, it seems like that person-to-person, peer-to-peer element is going to be important for the success of it. I don't know if others have kind of comments on that as well from what they've worked on or what they've seen.
May I add something here?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I do know of a study that was done through Abdul Latif lab from MIT Poverty Lab. And one thing they did notice with introducing this type of novel technology is how complex group functions. And they looked at something like a 25% adoption rate. If you hit that mark, and its chances are the adoption will significantly go up after that. And this was a study done in Malawi. And on top of that, I also have a question. Do you think like a framework like a choice architecture in nudging farmers, but just basically limiting the options will help for the escalating the adoptions of this novel technology?
So so thanks for the MIT report that from the JPAL group is a great report. So with regard to sort of your question about behavioral nudging and whether or not you limiting choice is an apparent factor in adoption or in use in this case, I think that we don't know. And the reason I say that is because there was so little actual socio demographic data collected across the studies. I pointed out that 30% of the studies collected anything with regard to age, education, sex, gender, or I don't have to say gender, sorry. So there's so little information that was captured there. And in order to be able to understand what constitutes a behavioral nudge, we need to know more about the people, right? We really need to know a lot more about the user group in particular to make kind of assessments on aggregated choice and behavioral nudging. But I think it's certainly like it's a next line of inquiry that's really, really important to understand.
Jaron, another question from the chat box. Did any of the studies discuss generational differences in adoption of digital technologies? And also, was there any discussion of agriculture becoming more interesting as a career option because of digital technologies?
So really great question. We were expecting to see a lot of information describing kind of generational differences just based on kind of common narratives, right? Like it's the youth who use technology and it's the youth who know how to use technology. We found a few studies that described it. They weren't as well evidenced, I think, with really kind of clear specific data to make concrete assertions about it. And actually, there was a paper that just came out recently that kind of described how the myth of youth in particular, not the myth of youth, but rather the narrative of youth as being really strong in digital technologies may in fact be holding back investment from national governments or from donors in appropriately kind of understanding what the actual barriers are. So I'll find that paper and then either put it on Canvas or send it around because it was a really interesting look at the problem. And then with regard to discussion of agriculture becoming a more interesting career option because of digital technology, we found studies that would sort of hint at that in the background or the framing of the problem, but not any real evidence where this was being tested either in secondary schools or in collegiate education. So great topic for the future, though, if anyone is looking for something. And I see another question here in the chat about how much is the lack of web access infrastructure playing into adoption in less developed regions. And I mean, I think that this is, so much of what we're still struggling with is with regard to a lack of infrastructure, right? Electricity, internet access, and internet access in terms of when do we have kind of a core group of users with data-enabled phones. So it's one thing to have a cellular phone that's equipped with 2 and 3G for text messaging and for phone calls. It's a totally different service spectrum. And there was a pretty good paper actually just put out from a researcher at UBC looking at this more specifically. And they did some new analysis based on GMSA data. So I can share that one as well.
Thanks. Jared, if you were to think forward to the next generation of this approach or this process, what are some things that you would like to see? What are some sort of gaps in the approach, challenges and the approach that you're wrestling with that you would like to resolve in that version 2.0.
So, I mean, yeah, again, this study was really focused at kind of what's the potential impact of donors, funding agencies, and researchers. And I would say to some extent, KV, I see your question about priorities at like the national government level. I really do think that as we're waiting for, we're always going to be waiting for kind of technology to catch up with the questions that we're asking. But I think it's time to kind of flip that model and say that we don't really need to wait for technology to catch up for us to be asking really important social questions about the detriments that technology can have. So we can be working on what are different kind of best practices or policies that can actually protect farmers in particular, women, and other groups from being exploited by different technologies. We don't need for the technology to be there for us to sort of see case studies of where we need to be having conversations at sort of the national and international level about this. So I would say that, where we maybe want to kind of step away from is being so, and I say this as a data scientist, being so excited about the technology that we kind of forget what's the humanity behind it and what are the human questions that we need to be asking. What can we do at the human level to better organize and put forward policies that are really going to kind of help protect the next generation. I would say also there's a real gap in terms of being able to work at sort of the interdisciplinary level. So we all have really, really good intentions, and we do see interdisciplinary work happening, but it's not necessarily something that's baked into our organizational structures. And it's also not something that's baked into our data collection methods. So just getting kind of more aligned on what are, when we want to do interdisciplinary work, what are the incentives that are in place? And kind of how is the institution actually, the institution in this case being academics, how are we being supported to do that?
Hey, Jaron, I have one more question, or maybe a comment rather. This really gearing towards the students here. Can you comment on this kind of trade-off between doing research in areas where people have real questions versus where there is data and evidence? Because doing this kind of work, you realize very much how almost a lot of the research is really looking for answers where there is data, and then you have all these dark spots in between where we really have serious big questions that have developmental implications, but there's very little data and knowledge available there. Can you comment on that, how students might help navigate that space?
Yeah, no, I think that's such a good question. And Ed, you may have some, I'm Terry too, you may have some thoughts on this as well, where, science is not necessarily designed to answer kind of real world applied questions in every context, right? There's kind of a different rhythm of science and a really important purpose for the scientific questions that we're asking. I think where this research is kind of better positioned is to think about what are the questions in particular that policymakers are asking, donors are asking, and where are we sort of transforming scientific research in a way that's reliable, transparent, fair, all of those things for other groups to be able to really take on board scientific recommendations and think about that. With regard to kind of where are we shining the lights when we do something like an evidence-based synthesis, it's really important that it can't be said enough. This is for a really discrete type of purpose, right? We use it to figure out kind of a stock taking exercise. Where are we now? Where do we know that we need to fill some gaps? But there is, we've got to think kind of about our different organizational structures of how we're bringing our scientific research agendas forward versus maybe our what I'll broadly call like our policy and learning and decision-making agendas. I don't know if that touches on it, but you might have some thoughts on that as well.
Excellent.
KV, did you want to follow up with your question?
No, I think, one of the things, Jaron, is, when you do a study like this, as you said, it is for a finite purpose for probably the Gates and maybe a couple of other large donors. But my question really related to what happens at the grassroots level in national programs or within, because, you know, when you look at a developing country, you have priorities which keep changing from one state to another or from one country to another. And majority of what happens is dependent on priorities and studies which are done at the local level. And then the funding is given by the local agencies. So global agencies, when they come in, you know, mostly it's 3 years, probably 5-year project, and then they disappear. So local sustainability of majority of what we are talking today depends on getting that local, as I would say, buy-in. And that buy-in would come in through a complete, careful farmer interviews, like the guy in Nepal. I mean, he asked, why is it that the apps are not being used? I mean, there must be a reason. Maybe the language is not correct. Maybe it could be expensive. Maybe it could be the technology. Maybe it could be the bandwidth. I mean, so on and so forth. So these kinds of studies usually they get into what we say gray literature. They don't get into publications, just like you mentioned. Many of these folks, you know, they don't have the resources to publish. So when we scan the literature, either through all the resources which we have, we might be missing some of the real stuff which is really needed to make these programs sort of sustainable. So getting that local buy-in, along with international donors, connecting with farmer knowledge, and then getting the policy people behind us in order to implement them, and then getting our students probably involved in bits and pieces of that information would be great. I'll stop there.
No, I think that's great. And I couldn't agree with you more, KV. That was kind of the sort of the tail end question that I asked is, how are we ensuring that basically the knowledge that can inform these questions best gets better disseminated and gets better use? It's an age-old question, but I don't think it's going away anytime soon. And when we do studies like this that are based, you know, again, that are based in the countries where so much of the research that could help inform it is maybe not accessible and available, how do we start treating that like a really important systemic issue and not just sort of relegated to one problem that needs to be solved in one area, but take a much bigger picture kind of networked global approach to it? Yeah, totally agree.
Jaron, I know we're beyond the time, and for those that have to leave, feel free to do so, but we have one more question. Samina Nazir from Pakistan has her hand raised. Go ahead, Samina.
Thank I just wanted to share an observation. The grassroots communities are, you know, quite skeptical of data collection process. And one of the reason is that a lot of people come and interview them and take data, and then they never come back to tell them what we did with that data, how we're going to use it. So I think that may be one of the reasons why they're not using the apps. We in our work have also taught many farmers about the apps. And then when we go back and we see that they're not really using them, and some of the issues are logisticals, but others are also for them to understand the value of all that work. So it would be good to research, you know, the skepticism of data by the local communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Samina. I think that's a great point. And there certainly is some work out there, but I think you raise, just such an important and relevant point, and one that's really, messaging that kind of can't be said enough. So thanks for bringing that point here.
Okay, well, thank you again, Jaron. Thanks so much. Really appreciate your talk today. Let me just remind people that if you want to see in a little more detail what that project looks like, Jaron posted the website. It's Agriculture in the Digital Age, all one word, agricultureinthedigitalage.com. And if you poke around a little bit on that website and interact with the data, I think you'll have a better sense of how this all works. So thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak with you today. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The great presentation. I learned a lot. Thank you. Thanks, Terry.